These are scraps from when I was working on the table that I'll be using to sort of illustrate it, because it could be a little bit complicated. Basically, this is what the game surface is made out of, and I drilled a bunch of holes and painted it. And then there are these wooden pillars underneath it, and then this is particle board, which is a bit stronger because the game surface isn't that durable. And this forms the air chamber. And then there are 8 of these edge pieces that go around it with slots that fit in.
We're good.
All right, awesome. So let's dive in. Okay, so the mission. This was kind of a 3-pronged thing. The first piece is I've been going to Priory for 7 years, and I kind of wanted to leave my mark on it a little bit. So with this project, I decided to give it to the dorms when I was done. And that way I could kind of have an impact, and it would be in a way that would bring people together. The second piece is I'm going to be studying mechanical engineering next year in college. And there's not a lot of classes to take in high school to test that out. So even though I had a gut feeling, that's kind of what I want to do. I haven't had the time to do projects in the past to explore it. So senior project was a really good way for me to dip my toes in the water and test it out. And then the final piece was, I thought it would be a fun twist. Instead of doing just the standard rectangle, kind of put my own spin on it. And it ended up being a lot more difficult than I expected. So because I have very little woodworking experience, I had to do a bit of research before I could start the project. I looked at a couple of articles that they were both for making rectangular air hockey tables, but they were really good for learning about the specifications. So how big to drill the holes, how far apart to make them, how to make this air chamber, that sort of stuff. So those ended up being super valuable. And then I read 3 books. The first one was the table saw book, and that gave me insight into tilting the blade. And the table saw is a really powerful tool, so it was important to learn how to use that. Woodworking Wit and Wisdom. That one was more about tips and tricks Jim Tolpin has picked up over 25 plus years of woodworking. So it was handy to kind of get that streamlined insight from an expert. And then the final one was Tage Frid Teaches Woodworking, which was about joining pieces of wood together in elegant and strong ways. Next thing, the books and the articles are nice, but you really need human input. So my mentor, Derek Witt, teaches at the Palo Alto Adult School, and I met him every couple weeks at Pally in the wood shop. And I would give him an update on what I'd done so far since the last update and what I was planning on doing for the next few weeks, and he'd give me his insight onto it and where he thinks I was going to run into problems and how he would plan around that. So he was super valuable. And then I spoke to Marcus Brown, who was another woodworking instructor at the Palo Alto Adult School and has over a decade of woodworking experience. And he and I talked about options for the legs of the table and making that strong, and how to mount the motor and the power supply underneath it. And then I spoke to Mr. Seiler, who's the head of the dorms, because even though I want the table, I had to make sure that the dorms wanted the table, and I didn't just show up at the end of the project with a huge thing and nowhere to put it. So I talked with him, and they have a pool table and a foosball table, but the problem is kids don't use them because they broke down and nobody knows how to repair them. So a really key point I made early on, and I just kept throughout the project, is making the table durable and having documentation attached to it so it can be fixed down the road. And then I sent out a survey to the dormers to see if they were interested in it, and as you can tell, people were very excited about it, which I was glad to see. So I charged ahead and we started building. Because there's not really a standard size for an octagon air hockey table, because people don't make those, I had to just take a guess about how big I wanted to make it. And I made a big piece of paper, cut it out to about the size I wanted, and I had my family sit on the floor in the 4 corners and pretend that we were playing. I felt confident with the size, so we went ahead to the next step. And unfortunately, you couldn't actually buy planks of wood, sheets of wood, as big as I needed them to be, so for it to be in one piece. So I had to buy 2 sheets and then draw out the octagon and then cut it. And eventually I had to glue it up. And then I cut the pillars for this air chamber. I'm not sure if this is strong enough or not. It was strong enough earlier for me to stand, yeah. So it's fairly sturdy. And I basically just got a big plank of wood and I cut it down into strips. And I ended up having to redo the pillars because the first time I did it, I wasn't thinking very clearly. And the pillars ended up being so big that they would cover up the holes. So I cut like a couple hundred pillars, and then they just became scrap wood. That's okay. I moved ahead. Then I started cutting the edge pieces. This is when that table saw book came in handy, because you had to cut them at an angle for them to fit together properly. And when I got to this step where I could place them on the ground in an octagon, it started to feel real, and I got a lot more motivation, because beforehand I was just doing little bits and pieces, and it didn't really feel like I was making tangible progress. But this is when I started to see the product come to life. But the edges were a little more complicated than just planks of wood. They have a big slot on the bottom for the particle board underneath to slide in, and then a smaller slot on top for the game board to slide in. And then I also attached this shelf here because I was worried about kids, trying to save the puck at the last second from the goal and hitting down and knocking the board out of the shelf. So I put this, the slot, pardon me. So I put the shelf in, and it made it a lot stronger and ended up helping with the assembly too. Then I glued up the particle board, and I put in some putty because I was really worried about that leaking out. If air leaks out there, it's going to be a disaster. You're going to have like a wall in the table. It would be a total mess. So I made sure that was really sealed up, and then I flipped it over and I traced out the octagon onto the particle board beneath it so they're the same size, and that made it a lot easier. And then I painted it. It took a coat of primer and then 4 coats of white paint, but it ended up turning out nice and glossy and shiny. I was feeling good about that. It felt like a real air hockey table. And then I drew lines. There are holes every inch, and it's 6 feet by 6 feet, so it's 72 lines in each direction. So it took a couple hours just to draw all the lines, and then it took a few more hours to drill all the holes. So that was a big process in and of itself. And then I assembled the air chamber. This took a couple tries because there's a lot of pieces, as you can imagine, when you're doing this, and they all are supposed to fit together really snugly. So that was super tricky, and the first try didn't work at all. I had my parents helping me, and there was glue everywhere, there was yelling, it was chaos, and it didn't fit. So we had to pull the whole thing apart and wipe off the glue and give it another run the next day. And eventually it worked. But in the process of trying to make it fit, one of the pieces cracked, the edge didn't quite reach, so there were some problems I had to solve as the project went forward. Then I mounted the motor and the power supply on the bottom. This is a piece of plywood because the particle board isn't that strong. So I basically cut a piece of plywood, attached it to the bottom of the table, and then attached the motor to that. And then we gave it a test, and it didn't work. That was not a good feeling. The puck barely slid. It was like trying to play on a sidewalk. It was really bad. I was very scared. So I tried a bunch of things. I re-drilled those like over 4,000 holes. I re-drilled them all to be bigger. That didn't work. I re-drilled some of them, and I felt like I had to complete it because it looked weird with some of them being bigger. But I could tell early on the bigger holes wasn't going to help. Some of the particle board had kind of like frayed. There are also these leaks along the bottom that I used caulking, which is like, it's the stuff in bathrooms that you use to seal up gaps. But what ended up fixing it was sanding down the surface a little bit, because when you drill through, there's a little bit of blowout, so there's a little bump on the table. And because the air cushion is so small, those bumps ended up having a huge impact on the puck, and it would keep hitting it and slowing down and slowing down. But once I sanded it, you could hit it all the way across the table, no problem. So once that worked, I felt like I had to go ahead to stain it, which took a little bit of time, but I was happy with how it looked. And I really thought the darker color gave it a more polished, real woodworking look to it. Then I attached the legs. If I had time, I would have built them, but building stable legs is really difficult. So I got 4 pairs of them from Home Depot and mounted them. Again, using the plywood because it's a bit stronger. And you just went under the table and you screw it in. And then I built the goals. Again, the original plan had to be changed here. I was going to build wooden boxes, but I didn't have time to build 4 boxes. So I put a piece of wood across the top, and then this fabric here loops down, and when the puck goes in, it'll drop down, and there's an opening on the side to reach in and pull it out. Which has the added benefit of when you hit the puck in really hard, it won't bounce out like in a regular air hockey table, which is something Mr. Cohen voiced his concerns about when I initially pitched this. Yeah, it won't bounce out. You can hit as hard as you want. So I finished it. This is the completed table right there, and there's a video, if you could play it, of me hitting a puck across, so you can see that it really works. Yeah, they slide. Yeah. Unfortunately, the story doesn't quite end there, because I built this in my garage. Oh no, we lost this. So I had to move it to the dorms. And can you just click to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. We had a move-in day. And I got my friend Devin. Devin came over with his truck, and we strapped in the table, and I made him drive it very slowly to school, and I walked next to it the whole time. There were a lot of speed bumps, and I was terrified it was going to slip and fall out the back and shatter. But luckily we made it. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, this works. I brought it into the dorms. When I was bringing it up, kids were super excited, and it felt really good to see that it wasn't going to waste. People were happy I made it. And right after I left, Miles sent me a picture of a bunch of kids playing it. And they're smiling too, so I felt really good. So as you can tell, it was a long project, and there were quite a few lessons I learned along the way. The first one was you have to take a deep breath before you cut something, because you're going to get sawdust in your mouth. It took a few tries to learn that one. The second piece is things aren't going to go how you planned it. You are always going to run into obstacles you didn't expect. Things will take longer than you thought. So you have to be flexible, and you have to be willing to change that original plan. And then the final one is you have to ask other people for help. My biggest obstacle in the whole project was I had very little woodworking experience beforehand. So I was talking with my mentor, and I was talking with my dad about what tools to use, how to assemble things so they're strong, how to use the tools safely, all sorts of stuff that I couldn't have done on my own. So using other people and their knowledge was super valuable. Thank you.